Mrs. Helen Johnson, a black woman in her mid-70s, decided to go to the grocery store as she always did. Mrs. Johnson had been a regular customer at Greenfield Groceries for as long as she could remember. The store was only a 10-minute walk from her modest home in the quiet neighborhood she had lived in for 30 years. Despite her age, Mrs. Johnson enjoyed the simple act of going to the store, walking around the aisles, and choosing the ingredients she needed for the meals she loved to cook. Helen had been through a lot in her life, but she always kept her head held high. She raised her children to be kind, hardworking, and proud of their roots. Now that she lived alone and her children were grown and living in different cities, her days were quiet. Going to the grocery store gave her something to do and a chance to say hello to the workers and even start a conversation with other customers. As Helen pushed her old metal shopping cart down the aisle full of fresh vegetables, she felt a sense of awe. She was a little tired in her legs, and her body, while still strong, reminded her every once in a while that she wasn't as active as she used to be. She slowed down her pace and went to the bins of potatoes to add some to her basket. Her arthritic hands moved carefully as she chose the ones that looked good. As she reached for the last potato, a loud voice from behind her startled her. Helen turned around to see two police officers walking toward her. They were both white, big men in their early 30s, and had serious faces. As he approached her, Officer Daniels narrowed his eyes and said, "Move, you're blocking the aisle." Helen, being the polite woman she was, said, "Oh, I'm sorry, officer. I didn't realize I was in the way." She then moved her cart closer to the shelves, giving them plenty of room to pass. The other officer, whose name tag said Officer Thompson, laughed but said nothing. Helen kept her head down and kept picking at her groceries because she didn't want to cause a fuss. Things got worse when she moved to the next aisle. Officer Daniels didn't seem ready to let it go. He followed her into the next section where the canned goods were. Helen tried to ignore him, but the tension was high. "Ma'am, you know there's a time limit for people to finish shopping here," Daniel said, even though there wasn't a rule like that at the store. Helen looked at him blankly and shook her head. "No, officer, I didn't know that." "Well, now you do," he snapped. Thompson laughed again, clearly finding humor in his partner's behavior. Helen, trying to stay calm, kept picking at her things. She had already been treated differently because of her skin color too many times, but it still hurt. She grabbed a few cans of soup and put them in her cart. Her hands were shaking, and it was hard to concentrate with the police officers looking over her like that. She thought about saying something, but she was afraid it would make things worse. Daniels and Thompson followed her as she made her way to the dairy section. With each step, they became more intimidating, and Helen could feel the eyes of other shoppers on her. No one said anything, but she could tell they were uncomfortable. The officers weren't just bothering her, they were making a show of her as if she were a criminal instead of a woman just trying to buy groceries. "Why are you walking so slowly?" Daniels asked, his voice sharp and impatient. "I'm an old woman, sir," Helen replied. Daniel laughed and said, "Maybe you shouldn't be out here." Helen felt a lump form in her throat, but she kept her head up. She wasn't going to let these men break her spirit after everything she had been through in her life. She had seen too much and fought through too much to be embarrassed by a couple of rude police officers. As she got closer to the milk section, Helen saw a familiar face. It was Maria, a store worker who had always been nice to her. Maria was stocking shelves nearby, and she noticed Helen. Concern filled Maria's brows as she watched Helen's interaction with the officers. Maria hesitated for a moment, clearly not sure what to do, but Helen gave her a small smile to reassure her not to get involved. Helen didn't want anyone else to be dragged into this unpleasant situation, so she reached for a carton of milk and put it in her cart. As she did this, Officer Daniels stepped closer, casting a shadow over her as he did so. He was trying to scare her into giving in. Helen wasn't going to give him that satisfaction. With all the dignity she could muster, she turned to him and said, "Officer, I'm just here to do my shopping. Please let me be." Daniel stared at her for a moment, his jaw tight, but he didn't say anything. Instead, he and Officer Thompson exchanged a look and walked away, leaving Helen standing in the AO with her heart racing. Little did she know that it was just the start of what would become an unforgettable event. Helen took a deep breath and tried to calm down as the two police officers walked away. The way they treated her had upset her, but she wasn't going to let it ruin her day. She had been through enough in her life to know that staying calm and moving on was sometimes the best thing to do. She turned her attention back to her shopping and was determined to finish quickly so she could go home and relax in her cozy living room. The grocery store, which had once been a place of peace for her, now felt like a place of chaos. Helen couldn't help but notice the curious looks from the other shoppers as she pushed her cart toward the bakery section. Some people had seen what happened, but no one said a word. She knew that their silence was because no one wanted to get involved in something that could get worse, but it still hurt. It was a reminder that sometimes people look the other way even when they see injustice. Helen saw Mrs. Thompson, a neighbor she knew from church, looking through the bread. Mrs. Thompson was a small, happy woman who always had a nice thing to say. Helen felt a little better when she saw her. "How are you today?" Mrs. Thompson asked with a warm smile as she noticed her. "I'm fine," Helen replied, "just doing some shopping." Mrs. Thompson could tell something wasn't right. "Are you sure you don't seem a little rattled?" Helen looked around for a moment to make sure the police weren't watching her. She didn't want to draw any more attention to herself. Helen started quietly. "I had a bit of a run-in with some officers a few minutes ago. They weren't very kind." Mrs. Thompson's smile faded, and her face turned serious. "Oh my, what did they do?" Mrs. Thompson asked. Helen told the story briefly, explaining how they had been rude to her and followed her around the store. Mrs. Thompson listened carefully, her eyes widening with each detail. "That's terrible," she said, shaking her head in disbelief. Mrs. Thompson put a gentle hand on Helen's arm and said, "I know, but what can I do? I just want to finish my shopping and go home." Helen nodded and said, "Okay, thank you." They said a few more nice things to each other before Mrs. Thompson continued her shopping. Helen was grateful for her concern, but she didn't want to think about what had happened any longer because she had already spent too much emotional energy on it as she reached for a loaf of bread. Helen saw a young man standing near her who seemed to be watching her. He was looking at the milk and occasionally glancing in her direction. Helen wasn't sure what to think. Maybe he had seen the fight with the police and was just curious. She tried to ignore by focusing on the task at hand, but as she walked down the aisle, the young man followed her, staying out of sight but close enough to feel like he was following her. She didn't want to be too paranoid. But after what happened with the police, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She quickly grabbed the last few things she needed and made her way to the checkout line, looking back to see if the young man was still there. He was, standing near the entrance, pretending to be on his phone, but his eyes kept darting toward her. Helen didn't want to think the worst, but she couldn't help but. As she walked up to the cashier, Maria, the friendly store worker she had seen earlier, greeted her with a smile, but her eyes quickly filled with worry when she saw Helen's tense expression. "Mrs. Johnson, are you okay?" Maria asked softly as she began to scan the groceries. Helen hesitated and looked over her shoulder again. The young man was still near the end entrance, pacing slightly, but not moving toward her. "I'm fine," Helen said, though her voice lacked conviction. "I just want to get home," Maria replied. As Maria quickly finished the transaction and bagged the groceries, she leaned in and whispered, "I saw what happened with the officers earlier. That wasn't right. If you need help, we can call the manager or someone." Helen felt touched by Maria's offer, but she didn't want to make a bigger deal out of it, so she shook her head and said, "Thank you, Maria, but I'll be fine. I just want to leave." Maria gave Helen a small nod and handed Helen the receipt. "Okay, but please take care, and if you ever need anything, don't hesitate to ask." Helen smiled, thanked Maria, and slowly pushed her cart toward the exit. She looked back at where the young man had been standing, but he was gone. The tension in her chest eased a bit, but she still felt uneasy as she stepped outside into the warm afternoon sun. Helen looked around the parking lot. It was busy as usual, with cars coming and going, people loading their groceries, and kids running around. Everything seemed normal, but the memory of what had happened inside still lingered. Helen saw her. She started walking slowly but steadily toward her car because she just wanted to get home, lock her door, and forget about the whole thing. But as she got to her car and started putting her bags in the trunk, she felt someone behind her. When she turned around, she half expected to see the young man or one of the police officers, but instead a big black SUV had pulled up next to her, and the windows were tinted so dark that she couldn't see who was inside. Helen's breath caught in her throat. She stood frozen next to her car and stared at the black SUV. The car was eerily still, and the engine was quietly humming. She could feel her heart beating faster, and her hands tightening around the grocery bag she was holding. There was something unsettling about how the SUV had pulled up so close without warning, and the dark windows made it hard to see who was inside. For a moment, she thought about going back into the store because it would be safer there with other people, but before she could act, the driver sighed. As the window slowly came down, a man in his mid-30s, with dark sunglasses and a cold expression, peered out at her. Helen couldn't tell if he meant any harm. "Ma'am, do you need any help?" the man asked, his voice calm but lacking any warmth. Helen's instincts told her to be careful, but she said, "No, I'm fine. Just loading my groceries." The man nodded, but his eyes lingered on her for a moment longer than she liked without saying anything else. Rolled the window back up and slowly drove away, merging into the flow of traffic leaving the parking lot. Helen took a shaky breath and tried to calm down. Maybe he was just another shopper offering help, she thought, but her gut told her that wasn't the case. She quickly finished loading her groceries, looking over her shoulder every few seconds to make sure no one else was watching her. The police and the mysterious SUV had made her feel vulnerable. Once she was done, Helen got into her car and locked the doors. It was hard for her to get off the steering wheel as soon as she sat down. The day had already been more stressful than she thought it would be, and now even leaving the grocery store felt hard. As Helen started her car and pulled out of the parking lot, she couldn't help but think of the man in the SUV. Something about the way he looked at her didn't feel right. She kept looking in her rearview mirror, half expecting to see the SUV following her, but as she drove down the street, the only cars she saw were. The normal traffic behind her didn't show any signs of the dark car. Helen tried to forget about what happened that day and focus on getting home safely. She just needed to get home, put away the groceries, and forget about everything else. As she pulled into her driveway, she saw her neighbor Mr. Evans out on his porch. He was a retired school teacher who was always friendly and polite. Seeing his familiar face was a small comfort after a long day. "Afternoon, Helen." Mr. Evans waved as she got out of the car and said, "Afternoon, Helen, Mr. Evans." Helen forced a smile because she didn't want to worry him about what had happened earlier. "Do you need help with those groceries?" he asked, noticing her full trunk. "No thank you, I've got it," she said, "but I appreciate the offer." Mr. Evans nodded and went back to his porch, leaving Helen to think. Helen quickly unloaded the groceries, her eyes darting around the neighborhood, still on edge from what happened at the store. She hated feeling like she couldn't trust her surroundings. When she got home, Helen locked the door and put the groceries on the kitchen counter. The peace and quiet of her home was nice, but the tension in her body wouldn't go away. She stood in the kitchen for a moment, letting the silence wrap around her like a blanket, but even in her safe space, her mind kept going over what happened that day. The police, the young man, the SUV, it was all too much for her. Helen sat down. She sat at the kitchen table with her hands over her head and thought about what had happened. She had dealt with racism many times before, but today's encounter with the police felt different, like it wasn't just a one-off event but the start of something more sinister. After a few minutes, she got up and started putting away the groceries to take her mind off of what had happened. She hadn't done anything wrong, so they didn't even have a reason to approach her. As she put the last item in the fridge, her phone buzzed on the counter. It was a text from her granddaughter Jasmine. "Hey Grandma, just checking in to make sure everything is okay." Helen smiled softly at the message. Jasmine always looked out for her, even though she lived across town and was busy with schoolwork. Helen thought about telling Jasmine what had happened, but she didn't want to worry her, and there wasn't much that could be done. "Now I'm fine, sweetheart. Just got back from the store. How are you?" She hit send and put the phone down, trying to forget about what had happened that day, but she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that lingered. Helen had always been proud of her strength and ability to deal with and move on with life's challenges, but today had left her shaken in a way she hadn't felt in years. As she stood by the window and looked out at the peaceful street, she had a thought: what if this wasn't over? What if there was more to come? Helen shook her head, trying to get rid of the thought. Still, the knot of worry in her chest wouldn't go away. Suddenly, her phone rang again. It was Jasmine. "Helen, I'm doing well, Grandma. I'll come by tomorrow to see you," she said. Helen smiled, feeling a little better. Jasmine's visits always made her feel better. Maybe tomorrow would be a better day. Maybe today was just a fluke. But deep down, she couldn't get rid of the feeling that this was just the beginning. The next day came and went, but Helen still couldn't shake the unease that had settled in her chest. Slept the night before, her mind replaying the events at the grocery store. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the officers' faces and their creepy smiles. The way they had looked at her as if she didn't belong had left an impression on her, and no matter how hard she tried, the event kept coming back to her. By mid-morning, Jasmine was at the door with a big smile on her face and a tight hug for her grandmother. Helen hadn't told her about the incident yet because she had decided she'd rather wait until they were. "Grandma, it's great to see you," Jasmine said, wrapping her arms around Helen. Jasmine was in her early 20s, full of energy, and always ready to bring light into the room. She was the kind of granddaughter that every grandmother wished for: thoughtful, caring, and always ready to listen. "It's great to see you too, sweetheart," Helen replied, hugging her back just as tightly. Having Jasmine here, even if only for a short time, made Helen feel more grounded. "Come on in, let me make us some tea," Jasmine said. The warm sunlight streaming through the windows, Helen's familiar surroundings, and Jasmine's presence began to calm her down. Perhaps today was the day she could finally relax. As they sat down to their tea, Jasmine looked at her grandmother closely and said, "You look a little tired, Grandma. Is everything okay?" Helen hesitated because she didn't want to worry Jasmine, but keeping the whole thing to herself wasn't helping either. She took a deep breath before speaking. "Something happened yesterday at the grocery store," raising an eyebrow. Helen told Jasmine everything that had happened, including how the police had approached her without a reason and treated her so badly. She even talked about the strange encounter with the man in the black SUV. As she spoke, Helen tried not to leave anything out, and Jasmine could see her worry growing. "They had no reason to bother me," Helen said, her voice shaking a little. "They did just because of how I look." Helen had dealt with racism before, but it had been years. "Something similar happened to me, and it made me feel helpless." Jasmine reached across the table and took her grandmother's hands in her own. "Grandma, I'm so sorry you had to go through that," she said softly. "That's awful, and it's not right, I know," Helen replied, squeezing Jasmine's hands. "But what bothers me more is this feeling I've had since it happened, like something's not finished yet. I can't shake the feeling that those officers weren't just doing this randomly, there was something more to it." Jasmine's face turned. Helen admitted that she didn't know what to say, but it seemed like they were trying to send a message. "I don't know why or how, but the way they looked at me wasn't casual, it felt personal." Jasmine frowned, her protective instincts taking over. "Did you report them?" "No, I didn't." Helen shook her head. She didn't see the point in calling the police, but Grandma, they can't get away with that. Jasmine insisted that you don't deserve to be treated that way. Helen let out a heavy sigh. "It seems like I'd be fighting a losing battle if I tried to change the system," Jasmine thought as she leaned back in her chair. She didn't want her grandmother to feel this way, but she could see Helen's point of view. The system wasn't really set up to protect people like Helen, people who looked like Helen. Jasmine had seen this happen in her own life, though not to the same degree. She couldn't let this go, so she suggested, "What if we did something?" Jasmine's voice was becoming more determined. If enough people know what happened, maybe someone will listen. Helen smiled softly at her granddaughter and said, "Sweetheart, I appreciate that, but I don't want to make a bigger mess out of this than it already is. I'm just worried about you." Jasmine asked, "What if this happens again, or what if those officers come back? You shouldn't have to fail this way in your own community." Helen agreed, understanding Jasmine's worry. She hadn't even thought that the officers might come back. She hated that the thought of him trying to scare her again or making her life harder just because they could even crossed her mind. For the rest of the afternoon, they talked about more fun things, like Jasmine's classes and their plans for the future. But every once in a while, Helen's mind went back to the police officers and that strange SUV. She thought about how her life had changed a little since the incident. It wasn't just about the groceries anymore, it was about something else. By the time Jasmine left that night, Helen was feeling a little better. Just being with Jasmine made things seem less scary, but as Helen sat alone in the quiet house, she couldn't help but feel like something was still there, just out of sight, unfinished. She locked the door and checked the windows to be safe. The night outside was calm, but the unease in her chest stayed. Helen wasn't the type to let fear control her, but Helen tried to convince herself that tomorrow would be better, that things would settle down, and that she could go back to her normal life. She thought that maybe the police had forgotten about her and the SUV was just a coincidence, but deep down she knew that wasn't true. Something had been set in motion, and she didn't know how to stop it. When Helen woke up the next morning, she felt like a storm was gathering on the horizon, and she didn't know when it would hit. She felt a little sleepy from the restless sleep the night before, but she knew she couldn't spend the day thinking about what happened. As much as the situation at the grocery store bothered her, she had other things to do. Life didn't stop for unfair situations, no matter how big or small. Helen got dressed and went to the kitchen to make her favorite breakfast, scrambled eggs, toast, and a small bowl of fresh fruit. Cooking had always been a way for her to relax. As the eggs sizzled in the pan, Helen tried to forget about the police officers and focus on something more positive. But as she went about her daily life, anxiety lingered just below the surface. It was like going outside had become dangerous. Could she really trust that nothing bad would happen again? Could she go back to her normal life without feeling watched? As Helen ate, she called her friend Margaret. They had known each other for a long time. Helen and Margaret had been friends for years and would often get together for coffee or lunch to talk. Margaret was the kind of friend who always knew what to say, and Helen needed that kind of support more than ever. After a few rings, Margaret's voice came on the line. "Helen, it's so good to hear from you. How have you been?" "I'm fine," Helen said. "Well, mostly fine. I've been meaning to tell you something." Margaret asked right away, noticing the change. Helen took a deep breath and told her friend everything, about the grocery store, the police officers, and the man in the SUV. The more she talked, the lighter she felt. It felt good to share it with someone who would understand. When she was done, Margaret was quiet for a moment to think about everything Helen had said. "That's terrible," Margaret finally said. "You didn't deserve any of that. What's wrong with those people?" "I don't know." Helen shook her head and said, "I wish I knew the answer. It felt so deliberate, like they were targeting me on purpose." Margaret said, "Unfortunately, racism is still alive and well. No matter how far we've come, there are still people out there who think they're above others just because of the color of their skin." Helen nodded, feeling a mix of frustration and sadness. She had hoped that the world would have changed more by now, and that these kinds of things would be a thing of the past. Margaret on the other end of the line told Helen, "You don't have to deal with this on your own. We could go to the community center and talk to some people there. Maybe they can help." Helen said, "I thought about that," and Margaret asked, "How could you make things worse by standing up for yourself?" Margaret's voice was firm, but caring. "These officers need to be held accountable. If they're treating you this way, they're probably treating other people this way too." Helen appreciated Margaret's support, but she wasn't sure what to do. She didn't want to make things worse, but she also knew that staying quiet might not be the best choice either. "I'll think about it," Helen told Margaret, trying to reassure her friend. "Take as much time as you need. Don't let this get to you. You deserve better than that." She stared quietly out the window for a while. The morning sun was bright and casting long shadows across her small garden. It was a peaceful scene, but Helen couldn't enjoy it because she was upset inside. She knew Margaret was right. She could have let her fear and anger control her, but she wasn't sure she was ready to take the next step. Later that afternoon, Helen decided to go for a walk around the neighborhood. She thought the fresh air would help her calm down. As she walked down the quiet streets, she saw some of her neighbors working in their yards. As she walked by, she waved and said hello briefly, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Every car that went by made her tense up, and she found herself looking over her shoulder more than once. She hated feeling like she couldn't even go for a walk without worrying about being watched or followed. Eventually, she made it to the small park near her house. It was a peaceful place with a few benches and a path that wound around a patch of grass. Helen sat down on one of the benches and took a deep breath to calm down. Suddenly, out of the corner of her eye, she saw something that made her heart race, the same black SUV she had seen at the grocery store parked across the street, right behind the line of trees. The windows were tinted, and the car seemed to blend into the shadows, but Helen knew it was there. She tried to stay calm by telling herself it was probably nothing, but as she looked away, she couldn't help but feel like she was being watched. Sitting there, the SUV didn't move, it just stayed parked as if watching Helen. As she got up from the bench, her legs felt shaky, and she tried to walk normally back to her house, but the feeling of being watched clung to her like a shadow. By the time she got to her front door, Helen's heart was racing, and she locked the door behind her and peered out the window, but the SUV was gone. It had disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, leaving Helen with more questions than answers. Something wasn't right. Helen paced back and forth in her living room, her mind racing with thoughts. Seeing that black SUV parked near the park had unnerved her in a way she hadn't expected. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched by unseen eyes. It wasn't just paranoia, she could feel it in her bones. As the day went on, she tried to take her mind off of things by doing small things around the house, like cleaning the kitchen, watering her plants, and even spending some quality time with her children. No matter how hard she tried to concentrate on something else, the memory of the grocery store encounter and the black SUV kept coming back to her. The thought that those police officers might be after her made her feel uneasy. By evening, Helen was sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the TV. She wasn't really watching it, her mind was too busy replaying everything that had happened. She knew she couldn't keep living in fear, but she didn't know what to do next. Should she tell someone, talk to the police, or just try to move on and hope it all goes away? Suddenly, Helen's phone buzzed on the coffee table, breaking the silence. She picked it up, thinking it was Margaret checking in on her, but when she looked at the screen, she saw an unknown number. She answered it cautiously. "Hello, is this Helen Johnson?" A stern male voice on the other end asked. "Yes, this is she who's calling." Helen replied, "This is Officer Daniels from the local police department. Would like to ask you a few questions about an incident that happened at the grocery store the other day." The officer's tone was cold and professional. Helen felt sick to her stomach. Why were the police calling her now? Why did she think something more was going on? "Oh," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "What do you need to know?" "We've received some information about your behavior at the store and would like to talk about it with you. Can you come down to the station tomorrow morning?" Helen wasn't sure what they were talking about because she hadn't done anything wrong. "What do you mean by my behavior?" Helen asked, her voice rising slightly in anger. "I understand you might feel that way, ma'am," the officer replied, his tone still distant and formal, "but we have a duty to investigate all sides of the situation. We'll talk about it in more detail when you come in." Helen's mind raced. She didn't trust the situation, but didn't want to make things worse by. After a moment of silence, she reluctantly agreed to meet with the police the next morning. As soon as she hung up the phone, a wave of anxiety hit her. This was becoming more serious than she had thought, and she wasn't sure she was ready for what was coming next. That night, Helen barely slept because she was too worried about what might happen at the station. She kept going over what she had done in the grocery store to figure out what she had done to deserve this much attention, but no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't figure it out. Helen thought about it but couldn't come up with anything. The next morning, she got dressed and ready to go to the police station. She wore her nicest clothes to make a good impression, but deep down she was scared. Walking into that building knowing that the officers she would be facing might be the same ones who harassed her at the store made her stomach turn. Before she left, Helen called Margaret to let her know where she was going. "I'm going to the station," she said, trying to sound calm. "They want to ask me some questions." Margaret asked, "Are you going alone?" Helen replied, "I'll be fine," but she wasn't sure she believed it herself. "It's probably just a formality." "I'll call you when it's over," Helen said. Margaret insisted on going with her, but Helen didn't want to involve her friend. She thanked her for the offer and promised to keep her informed. When Helen arrived at the station, her heart was racing. The building was intimidating, with its high walls and cold, sterile air. She took a deep breath, walked in, and approached the front desk. "I'm here to see Officer Daniels," she said, her voice steady, even though she was scared. The receptionist nodded and pointed her toward a waiting area, saying, "HEK will be with you shortly." Helen sat down, her hands shaking slightly as she waited. The minutes went by slowly, and she couldn't help but wonder if this was some kind of trap or if they were trying to scare her into silence. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, hours, Officer Daniels showed up. He was tall and broad-shouldered, and his expression didn't give Helen any comfort. He motioned for Helen to follow him into a small interrogation room. The walls were blank, and the light above cast a harsh glow over the metal table and chairs. "Please have a seat," Officer Daniels said, pointing to one of the chairs. Helen sat down, trying to stay calm, and she could feel the tension in the air as Officer Daniels took his seat across from her. "We're here to talk about what happened at the grocery store." He started folding his hands on the table and saying, "We've received complaints about your behavior, and we need to clarify a few things." Helen clenched her jaw and said, "Complaints about her behavior?" This was getting more and more ridiculous by the minute. "With all due respect, officer, I was the one who was being bullied by your coworkers. They harassed me for no reason, and now you're telling me I'm the one under investigation." Officer Daniels didn't answer right away, he just stared at her. He finally said, "We're not here to make any assumptions," but the room was dead quiet. "We need to hear your side of the story." Helen took a deep breath and started to describe everything that had happened at the store from the time she walked in to the time she left. She made sure not to leave out a single detail and made sure to stress how the officers had singled her out and treated her badly. When she was done, Officer Daniels was quiet for a long time. As if thinking about what she said, he stood up and said, "Thank you for your time." His tone was still as distant as ever, and he said, "We'll be in touch." Helen blinked, confused. Was that it? She was expecting an explanation or resolution, but instead she was left with even more questions than before. As she left the station, her mind was racing because her short conversation with Officer Daniels had left her more confused than ever because he had ignored her story about the grocery store. The store incident made her feel like her words weren't being taken seriously. As she walked to her car, her footsteps echoed on the pavement as she tried to calm down. Sitting in the driver's seat, Helen took a deep breath and tried to collect her thoughts. The more she thought about the conversation, the more she felt like something was wrong. They had called her in, questioned her, but hadn't given her any answers. It seemed like they weren't even interested in finding the truth. Instead, they were set on making. As Helen drove home, the silence in her car was heavy. She didn't turn on the radio because she couldn't focus on the sounds around her. Her mind was elsewhere, back at the grocery store, on those embarrassing and scary moments. She had thought that calling the police would help, but now she felt like she had stepped into something much bigger and more unsettling. When she got home, she parked in her driveway and just sat in her car for a moment, staring out the window. The clean lawns and quiet streets of her neighborhood felt like a world away from the chaos going on in her mind. She couldn't shake the feeling that something else was going on that she couldn't see yet. But what was it? Helen decided to call Margaret because her friend had been so helpful for everything and she needed someone to talk to. When the phone rang, she felt a knot in her chest tighten. "Hello, Margaret." Margaret's voice was warm and familiar. "It's me," Helen said. "I just got back from the station," which made Margaret's tone change right away. "What happened? Did they explain anything?" she asked. "No," Helen sighed. "They asked me a bunch of questions, but it felt more like an interrogation than anything else. They didn't give me any answers. It's like they're trying to turn this all around on me." "That's ridiculous," Margaret said. "You're the victim in all of this. What are they playing at?" Helen asked quietly. "It doesn't feel right. I'm starting to think this is." Margaret was silent for a moment as she thought. "Do you think it's something deeper, like they're trying to cover something up?" Helen replied, "I don't know, but that's how it felt." The two women talked for a while longer, trying to figure out what was going on. Margaret offered to come over, but Helen turned her down, saying she needed some time alone to think about everything. When they hung up, Helen sat on her couch and stared at the walls of her apartment. Helen's life went on as usual, or at least as normal as it could be for her. She tried to focus on her normal activities like going grocery shopping, going to church, and taking care of her plants, but she couldn't get rid of the feeling of unease that lingered like a shadow. The black SUV that had been following her around for days didn't show up again, but that didn't stop her from looking over her shoulder every time she went out. She felt like someone was watching her and waiting for her to act. Helen felt like people were staring at her more often at the grocery store, but she wasn't sure if it was just her imagination or if they could sense her stress. One afternoon, she decided to go for a walk to clear her mind. She put on her comfortable shoes and headed down the quiet streets of her neighborhood. The fresh air helped ease her body's tension, and for a moment she forgot about her problems. As she turned the corner, she saw something strange. A police car was there. The sight of the parked car across the street, its engine idling, made her stomach flip. She couldn't tell if the officers inside were watching her, but the car's presence felt too coincidental. It was as if they were making sure she knew they were there watching and waiting. Helen sped up, her heart racing. She didn't want to seem paranoid, but she also knew what she was feeling wasn't in her head. By the time she got home, her nerves were shot. She double-checked her locks, made sure all the windows were shut, and pulled the curtains back. She couldn't get rid of the feeling that the police were trying to scare her into silence so she wouldn't speak out or do anything else that night. Helen couldn't sleep because she kept thinking about the grocery store, the police station, and the strange police car parked outside. Why were they after her? What were they trying to hide? Most importantly, what should she do next? Helen wasn't the type to cause trouble. She had always lived a quiet life, never wanting to make waves. But this was different. It wasn't just about her. It was about standing up for herself, her honor, and what was right. The next morning, she decided to go to the community center, where people in the area got together to talk about problems in their communities and help each other. Helen thought that maybe she could find some help there. Someone had to know what was going on, or at least how she could stay safe. When she got to the center, it was packed with people. She recognized some familiar faces and felt a small sense of comfort. She wasn't alone in this. There were caring people in the community who would be there for her if things got worse. Helen saw a group of women sitting together with their heads bowed in conversation. One of them was Mrs. Thompson, a kind 65-year-old who had been active in local activism for years. Helen approached them with a bit more hope. "Hello, Mrs. Thompson," she said in a soft but steady voice. "I was wondering if I could talk to you for a moment." The woman looked up and smiled warmly. "Of course, Helen. What's on your mind?" she asked. "It's about the police," Helen began slowly. "Something happened at the grocery store." Helen sat across from Mrs. Thompson, feeling the weight of the moment she had just been through. Helen had never been one to talk openly about her problems, especially when it came to something so personal and painful, but she had no choice now. She had been carrying this burden for days, and it was too much for her to handle by herself. Mrs. Thompson leaned forward a little, her eyes full of concern and curiosity. The other women at the table fell silent, sensing that what Helen was about to say was serious. The room was busy, but in this small circle, time seemed to have slowed down. "Helen," Mrs. Thompson said gently, "we're here to listen." Helen nodded and began to think about the day everything had changed at the grocery store. She told them how she had been minding her own business, just trying to buy a few groceries, when the two officers approached her. She talked about how hostile they were and how they had embarrassed her in front of everyone. She also talked about how helpless she had felt at that moment. The women listened carefully, their faces becoming more serious. Mrs. Thompson's face hardened with each word, and her hands gripped the edge of the table as if she were trying to hold back her anger. "When I tried to report it," Helen said, her voice breaking slightly, "they didn't even take me seriously. It was like I was the one in the wrong." The group roared with anger, and a younger woman named Anita shook her head in shock. "How can they treat you like that? You didn't do anything wrong." Helen shrugged, feeling her frustration rising. "I don't know why," Mrs. Thompson spoke up, but her voice was steady and firm. "This isn't just about you, Helen. It's about something bigger. They think they can push us around because they don't expect us to fight back." Helen felt a mix of anger, sadness, and hope, but what could she do? She had tried to call the police, but they wouldn't listen. Mrs. Thompson thoughtfully nodded and said, "I understand, and you're right to feel frustrated. But you're not alone in this. We've been fighting this kind of injustice for years. It may seem like a losing battle at times, but we've made progress, and we can't stop now." Anita spoke up and said, "We need to make sure people hear your story, Helen. The police can't just get away with treating you this way." Helen replied, "I've already tried to talk to them. I went to the station, and they acted like I was. They were wasting their time," Mrs. Thompson said with a sad smile that was heavy with experience. "There are other ways to fight back. We can bring this to the attention of the community. The more people who know about what happened, the harder it will be for them to sweep it under the rug." Helen felt anxious at the thought of her situation becoming even more public. She had never wanted to be the center of attention, let alone in such a painful and embarrassing way, but she also knew that keeping quiet would make things worse. "I guess I'm not ready for that," Helen said. "It's been so hard already." Mrs. Thompson said, "Remember, you don't have to do this alone. We'll stand with you and make sure your voice is heard." The other women at the table nodded in agreement. Helen looked at each of them and felt a sense of solidarity she hadn't felt in days. For the first time in days, she felt like she wasn't carrying this burden by herself. Maybe she could find some help. The strength to stand up for herself. The conversation then turned to more practical issues. They talked about how to bring attention to Helen's story, starting with a meeting at the community center where she could talk about it. Mrs. Thompson also suggested reaching out to local groups that worked on civil rights issues. Helen's story, as painful as it was, had to be a part of a bigger fight for justice. As they talked, her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she felt her stomach drop. It was a text message from. She read the message again, her hands shaking. It was only 3 words long, but it was clear that someone was trying to scare her into silence. She showed Mrs. Thompson the message, and Mrs. Thompson frowned deeply. "Who would do something like this?" Helen whispered, her voice shaking. Mrs. Thompson looked at the phone and then back at Helen. "It could be anyone who doesn't want you to speak out, but don't let that stop you. That's exactly what they want." Helen nodded, even though fear was creeping into her heart. She already felt very vulnerable, and now it seemed like someone was watching her and trying to scare her into giving up. But she didn't have a choice. If she didn't say anything, nothing would change, and if she did, she didn't know what would happen next. The next few days were a blur of worry and preparation. Helen spent hours going over what she would say at the community meeting, Not sure if she could handle the pressure, Mrs. Thompson kept in touch with her, giving her advice and reassurance. The text message still. Helen tried to ignore it and focus on the task at hand. When the meeting day finally came, Helen felt a knot of nerves in her stomach. The community center was full of familiar faces, people she had seen at church or in the neighborhood over the years, but they were all there for a different reason today. They were here to listen. Helen stood at the front of the room, her hands on the edges of the podium, and she could feel the weight of their expectations. The room was silent as Helen spoke. As she spoke, her voice started out shaky, but got stronger with each word. "I never thought I'd be standing here talking about something like this," she said. "But what happened to me at the grocery store wasn't just an isolated incident. It's part of something bigger, and we can't stay silent anymore." The community center was buzzing with energy as more people came in. Helen had never seen it so full before. Word had spread quickly about the meeting, and it seemed like everyone wanted to be there. Helen was nervously pacing in the small room behind the stage. She wasn't used to talking in front of so many people, let alone about something so personal. Her heart was racing, and her palms were sweaty. She could hear the low murmur of voices from the audience and feel the excitement building. The memory of that text message still lingered in the back of her mind. "Watch your back." It was short, but it carried a heavy weight that someone didn't want her to carry. That fact alone made her even more determined to tell her story. Mrs. Thompson poked her head into the room and said, "You're ready." Helen took a deep breath, nodded, and walked out to the stage. As she stepped onto the platform, the room went silent, and she could feel hundreds of eyes watching her, waiting to hear what she had to say. For a moment, she wondered if she could do it, but then she remembered why she was there. She wasn't just talking for herself. She looked at Mrs. Thompson and gave her a reassuring nod. Helen cleared her throat and stepped up to the microphone. At first, her voice shook, but as she spoke, the words came out more naturally. "I didn't want to be here today," Helen began. "I didn't want to be the person standing in front of all of you talking about what happened, but staying silent is no longer an option." The audience was still holding their breath for her every word. Helen's voice got stronger as she spoke. "That day, I went to the grocery store like I always do, but something was different. As soon as I walked in, I could feel their eyes on me, 2 police officers. I didn't know why they were watching me, but I could feel it. A few people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, as if they knew exactly how I felt. They followed me," Helen said, her voice catching in her throat. "I wasn't doing anything wrong, but they did follow me anyway, and what I asked them. They laughed in my face, because they didn't care about me or what was right, they just wanted to scare me, and it worked. I was scared." There was a collective groan of agreement, and Helen could see the anger building in their eyes. She wasn't the only one who had been treated this way. It wasn't just about her, it was about something much bigger. "They harassed me in front of everyone," she said. "They called me names, insulted me, and tried to make me feel small, but I wouldn't be small." Helen felt a rush of energy go through her. She wasn't just telling her story, she was giving a voice to the many others who had been silenced. But Helen didn't stop there. She said, "After I left the store, I went to the police station to report them. I thought that if I told the truth, something would happen, but nothing did. They didn't care. They brushed me off, just like the officers had done. That's when I realized they think they can get away with this because..." The audience was tense and waiting for Helen to say, "I'm tired of it." Helen replied, "I'm tired of being scared and treated like I don't matter. I know I'm not the only one. That's why we have to stand together. That's why they can't silence us anymore." Mrs. Thompson then stepped forward and put her hand on Helen's shoulder. "You're right," she said to the crowd, "this isn't just about Helen. It's about all of us. We've been quiet for too long. It's time to speak out." Cheered, and Helen felt a glimmer of hope for the first time in a long time. Maybe things could change, maybe they could fight back. But as soon as the cheers stopped, Helen's phone buzzed again, and she quickly froze another message. This one was even scarier than the last one. "You think you're safe, now think again." Her heart raced as she showed Mrs. Thompson the message. The older woman's face hardened, but she quickly calmed down. "They're trying to scare you," she said quietly. Helen shook with fear as she nodded. The meeting went on, with more people speaking about their own experiences with injustice. The crowd was passionate, energized, and ready to take action, but Helen couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Someone didn't want her to continue, and she had no idea what they would do next. Helen was still upset about the threatening message, but she couldn't let it stop her. She left the community. Despite the support, Helen stayed on edge because she couldn't shake the feeling that she was still being watched. The city was buzzing with talk about her story, and now she had to take the next step. In the days that followed, Helen received many messages of support from both strangers and friends. The local media had picked up her story, and it seemed like everyone wanted to hear what she had to say. Her story had become a symbol of resistance, and people were rallying behind her. She felt like she was being watched after the meeting, and any sudden noise made her jump, but she wasn't going to let that stop her. The grocery store where the incident happened was an important part of her story, and Helen decided she needed to go back there. She wasn't going to let fear run her life, and with Mrs. Thompson by her side, she walked back into the store to show that she wasn't afraid. As they walked in, Helen felt the weight of the stares from the employees and customers. It was clear that the store was full. Authorities were on high alert because the officers who had teased her weren't on duty that day, but Helen's presence made it clear that the story wasn't going away. She went up to the manager, a tall man with a serious face, and said, "I'm here to talk about what happened here." The manager hesitated, then said, "Let's go to my office." Helen and Mrs. Thompson followed him to a small office in the back of the store. The manager shut the door behind them and sat down behind his desk. "I'm sure you know why I'm here," Helen began. The managers looked uncomfortable and said, "We're taking this seriously. The harassing officers are no longer working here, but we're still looking into what happened." Helen wasn't satisfied with just words. She wanted an assurance that nothing like this would ever happen again. The manager shifted uncomfortably and said, "We're doing our best, but it's a process." Helen's patience was wearing thin. This was more than just a process. It was about people's lives, including her own, and I want to make sure you're. The conversation ended with promises but no concrete steps. Helen felt like she hadn't accomplished much, but she knew she couldn't stop now. Her next step was to keep the story in the news. Her actions caught the attention of a local activist group, who reached out to her offering their support. They were known for their work fighting police brutality and racial discrimination, and they wanted to work with Helen to keep the story alive. Helen met with the group in a small, dimly lit office. The room was full of passionate people who shared her anger and determination. They talked about ways to make sure that her story reached even more people. One of the activists, a young woman named Maya, suggested that they hold a march to show the city that they weren't going to back down. Maya said that the march would bring people together and make sure that our voices were heard. Helen agreed that the march could be a powerful way to show solidarity. The group started planning the event, and soon flyers and posters were all over town, inviting everyone to join the march. On the day of the march, Helen, Mrs. Thompson, and Maya stood at the front with the crowd in front of City Hall, holding signs and chanting justice. Helen felt a rush of adrenaline as she looked out at the sea of faces united for the same cause. The march was a success, attracting a large crowd and getting a lot of media attention. Helen renewed her call for justice and accountability to the press. Her words were strong and clear, and they spoke to many people who had felt the same way but had never had the courage to speak out. The next day after the march, Helen brought a different message: "You've caused a lot of trouble, we're watching you." Helen showed the message to Maya and Mrs. Thompson. Their faces were serious, but they remained resolute. Maya said, "We can't let them scare us. We've come too far despite the." Helen kept up her campaign. She met with city officials, pushed for policy changes, and went to community meetings. Her resolve never wavered, and her story continued to inspire others to speak out against injustice. As the weeks went by, the tension between the store and the police seemed to ease, but Helen knew that the real work had just begun. She had to keep pushing for change, not just for herself, but for everyone who had been through similar problems. Her bravery and determination had a big effect on her community. People knew more about Helen's problems and were more willing to stand up and speak out. Helen's fight wasn't over, but she had shown that one person's voice could make a difference, even when they were scared or intimidated. Helen's story continued to inspire people, reminding them that standing up against injustice was worth every effort, no matter what. If you liked this story, please like and subscribe, and join the conversation by telling me where you were watching this video from and what time are you watching it right now.